For centuries, Africa was defined by others. Its story was told in the language of pity, policy, and profit. Its nations were mapped not by destiny, but by design. The world saw Africa as a source of wealth, not wisdom. But history has a strange rhythm, and every empire that dictates soon forgets that silence is never consent. It began with whispers, a small group of nations in the Sahel, weary of humiliation, tired of dependency. They did not raise their voices first. They raised their minds. At the heart of this awakening stood one man, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. To the west, he was defiance. To Africa, he was reflection. Because his revolution was not just military. It was mental. He looked at his people and saw something the world had forgotten: potential. He looked at the soil beneath his boots, and saw gold that had never fed the hands that mined it. He looked at the sky, and realized no foreign flag should decide what freedom means on African land. When Traoré rejected Western control, the world laughed. They said Burkina Faso would crumble within months. But it didn't. It adapted. And that single act of survival became the spark that set a continent ablaze. Suddenly, Africa began to believe that isolation was not death, it was detox. That dependency was not life, it was a leash. Across the borders of Mali, Niger, and Guinea, leaders began rewriting the grammar of governance. They replaced foreign advisors with local thinkers. They drafted new contracts that guaranteed national ownership, majority stakes in their own destiny. These were not slogans. They were safeguards. In diplomatic halls once dominated by European voices, African leaders now sat as equals. Trade deals were signed on African terms. Energy contracts demanded transparency. And the world, accustomed to dictating, began to hesitate. Because Africa was no longer begging. It was bargaining. And that was a revolution greater than any coup. By 2026, the ripple had turned into a tide. The so-called Sahel model became the blueprint of independence. A doctrine that said, real development begins when a nation defines its own value. When it disconnects from conditional loans and reconnects to self-worth. In Washington, policymakers debated how to control nations that no longer sought approval. In Brussels, old powers softened their rhetoric, offering equality after centuries of exploitation. Even France, once the self-proclaimed guardian of Francophone Africa, began losing its grip. The CFA franc, that invisible chain, was being cut link by link. One nation after another began demanding restitution for decades of stolen wealth. And as the old empire panicked, a new one quietly took form, not of conquest, but of consciousness. Across Lagos, economists argued for a naira backed by gold. In Cairo, new energy policies prioritized local consumption over export dependence. In Johannesburg, investment funds poured capital into African-made industries. And in Addis Ababa, thinkers gathered to discuss what no Western forum dared to admit, that Africa was no longer a subject. It was the scriptwriter. This wasn't coincidence. It was contagion. A quiet, intellectual revolution spreading faster than any virus. A movement that understood something profound. In the 21st century, power isn't about who fires the first bullet. It's about who controls the first transaction. For centuries, the West's advantage wasn't just military. It was mental. It defined what progress meant, what democracy looked like, and what development required. It dictated the rules, and called that order. But when Traoré refused to play by those rules, he broke more than their control. He broke their monopoly of meaning. Because when one African nation redefines what power looks like, the entire world has to rewrite the sentence. And that rewriting began everywhere. Russia no longer dealt with Africa as a subordinate, but as a strategic partner. Turkey built defense factories on African soil, not aid offices. China stopped dictating terms and started listening to them. Even India saw in Africa a reflection of its own post-colonial spirit, a partnership of equals, not exploitation. For the first time in modern history, Africa was not anti-West, it was post-West. It no longer orbited around foreign capital. It began generating its own gravitational field. The world had been built on invisible obedience, nations silently agreeing to roles they never chose. Africa was breaking that habit. And when obedience dies, hierarchy collapses. The result was not chaos. It was correction. Now, African engineers built refineries with local hands. African universities produced innovation instead of imitation. African currencies began trading in regional blocks. And for the first time, the term "made in Africa" no longer meant low cost, it meant full control. Traoré understood something deeper than rebellion. He knew that dignity isn't emotional, it's infrastructural. It lives in the power grid that doesn't depend on donations. It lives in the refinery built by African sweat. It lives in the school funded by local taxes, not foreign aid. Because the real revolution isn't in the speeches, it's in the spreadsheets. Africa was learning the arithmetic of independence. And as the continent aligned with its own logic, it found its rhythm again. The rhythm that had been buried under centuries of imported definitions. Now, the drums of a new Africa began to echo, not in war, but in work. Not in protest, but in progress. This awakening wasn't loud. It was deliberate. It wasn't chaotic. It was calculated. And as the world watched, something unprecedented happened. Global markets began to adapt to Africa, not the other way around. International investors realized that stability now meant African cooperation. Tech giants shifted their headquarters to Accra, Nairobi, and Kigali. The continent once exploited for raw materials became the hub of renewable energy, digital innovation, and cultural export. From Afrobeat to fintech, from cobalt to code, Africa's assets were no longer underground. They were online. The West's old question, "Can Africa survive without us?" was now replaced with a new one. Can we survive without Africa? And that question haunted every boardroom, every policy meeting, every election speech in the so-called developed world. Because the empire's greatest fear was never rebellion, it was relevance. The moment Africa stopped asking for permission to think, the global order began to tremble. Because every empire depends on its former colonies believing they still need guidance. But when those nations begin to think independently, the empire fades, not with a war, but with a whisper. Traoré's revolution had proven something eternal. That you don't need to conquer the world to change it. You only need to redefine yourself, and the world will adjust. Now, as Africa stands on the horizon of a new era, its challenge is not freedom, but focus. Not how to escape the past, but how to engineer the future. Because true power is not in rejecting the West. It's in outgrowing it. Africa has entered its renaissance. Not one of marble and music, but of minds and machines. A renaissance built on logic, not longing. On ownership, not obedience. The continent that was once the world's warehouse has become its workshop. The people once called developing have become the developers. And the nations once enslaved by debt now hold the key to global growth. The world thought it was watching a rebellion. But what it was really witnessing was a rebirth. Burkina Faso lit the match. Africa became the flame. And as that fire spreads, it does not burn the world. It lights it. Because the truth is simple. Every empire begins to fall. The moment those it once ruled begin to think differently. And today, Africa is thinking.